From the looks of it, 2019 will be a dismal year for India economically. And to discuss that and the minutiae of what's gone wrong, joining me is economist Salman Soz. Salman, thanks very much for joining us today and having this chat with me. The last time we spoke, you had released a book called The Great Disappointment, where you analyzed large periods in India's history economically. How would you describe what's happened so far since 2014 to the present date?
Um, Look, if you look back at what was happening in 2014, there was a new government in place. That government had come at a time when the previous government had drawn a lot of criticism. Uh, uh, Everything, there was stuff about town policy paralysis and things like that, and the economy at that time had been going relatively slowly. But as observers have noted, as I've noted in my own book, uh, the economy was actually coming up, recovering in the last year of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's government. And that budding recovery actually ran into some headwinds, in 2014 and 15, because there were deficient monsoons at that time. But on the positive side, the global oil market kind of slumped, and India had that as a fall gain. So there were both positives and negatives at that time. But there was one issue that was very critical that I believe the government did not pay adequate attention to, and that was this relatively, at that time, still an emerging crisis in the banking sector. I don't think the government paid any attention to that, or at least scant attention to that until 2016, I believe. And any economist will tell you that the banking sector, the financial sector, is the lifeblood of an economy. And I think what was happening is that part was choking, and India was getting, in some ways, a bit of a heart attack, the Indian economy. And I think not paying attention to that created serious problems. They were not recognized early on, and I think then, of course, in 2016, the agricultural sector started seeing some improvements, but of course, then there was demonetization, then of course GST, and here we are. We keep talking about the slowdown. By the way, I've been writing about this for such a long time. I was looking at my past articles, and I talked about a slowdown in 2015. Nobody believed the things those days. Those were heady days of Achhe Din. But now we're in a very difficult situation. I don't, if you look at all the indicators, I mean, pretty much everything that you look at right now, you look at GDP growth, per capita income growth, unemployment, banking sector NPAs, investments, savings, personal debt, credit flow, exports, and imports, everything, agricultural sector, industrial sector. This is a generalized slowdown. This is not a cyclical downturn. It has elements of having a cyclical downturn, but it is a generalized economy-wide slowdown. And I would say that it is a huge problem.
There's also been, Salman, a rash of downgrades that we've seen in terms of economic growth. It's all pointing to sub 5% for sure, and perhaps a more protracted slowdown as well. What have you made of it, and does it look more likely to you as well that India could be ticking at a sub 5% rate for itself?
Well, the first part is easier because I don't really have the kinds of models that these companies run. So I would defer to them, but I do think that sub 5% looks eminently possible. But I always kind of keep telling people that do apply the Arvind Subramanian discount, because Arvind Subramanian, the former chief economic advisor, talked about how we might have been overestimating growth by about 2.5 percentage points, not 2.5%, 2.5 percentage points. There's a huge gap. So I would say that if India is growing at 5%, and imagine that is the real number, I think that is terrible for this kind of an economy. It's a low middle income country. I remember Mr. Jaitley, the late Mr. Jaitley, came to Washington and talked about 8 to 10% growth. I think this was 2015 or 2016. I don't remember exactly when.
Emerging conditions in the market and then taking appropriate actions itself was possible. And as we continue with these sets of reforms, I think there is a huge amount of opportunity, as the Secretary mentioned, in the IBC assets, the stressed assets which are now going to be increasingly becoming available. There's a huge amount of opportunity in the infrastructure sector, because the kind of activity which is going on and which is planned down, if you look down the tunnel and see what's planned as far as the Indian Railways is concerned, the seaports are concerned, the new regional airports are concerned, the highways program goes on. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity.
We're now kind of talking about green shoots, and this is 2019. This is a. I think this is a very, very serious matter. I think the government has to take responsibility, and I think the government has made a lot of mistakes. But so I do think that we're going to likely be around 5%, maybe less than that. But that is not the real problem. I think the real problem is your second point, and the second point is, okay, people see this as an inflection point, and then things are going to look up, and then we start going to grow back to 6%, maybe 7%, maybe 8%. I'm not that sanguine about all this, because I think people are just not focusing on the future. I'm sorry to say that even very respectable people with whom I have lots of agreements on how this government has underperformed, even they seem to be focused on the short term. I think the country needs to look at what is happening around the world, what the future looks like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. And I would say that we're not even talking about those kinds of things. We're so focused on the short-term GDP numbers and all this stuff. We have to ask ourselves, why is this happening? I mean, if you think about China, by the way, in the World Bank's income classification system, where now India is a low middle income country, in 1989, there were about 49 countries that were low income. China was one of them, India was one of them. 49 for which we have data, all the way from there to 2017. Only 5 countries made it to the upper middle income level. India is a low middle income, at a low middle income level. Only 5 of them. Only one of them is a large economy. That is China. We have to see what is going on in other countries. What have they done? We're just not learning the lessons. I keep hearing about, the critics of Pandit Nehru and the governments, the early governments that India had. The critics would argue that, look what Korea did, look what the East Asian countries did, look what China did. I believe a lot of this is a kind of a lazy criticism, because you have to see what the context of each country is. But one could say that we have to learn from what other countries are doing. But we're still not doing that. So I think the short-termism is going to be extremely damaging. It already is. I mean, you have to think about China has been growing at about 9% or 10%, I don't know, for decades. India is not there at all. And there seems to be no framework for that. So even everybody is writing articles about how we're soon going to have a revival and we're going to grow again and all that. But you have to have some basic reforms in the economy that will sustain that recovery. Otherwise, you're again going to have a sugar rush, and then you're going to fall back. And but I'm dismayed by what I see. I think the government obviously is focused on the craziest of issues, the most divisive of issues. Breaking apart the social fabric of the country, but not really focused on where India is going to head into the future. That is something that we need to pay a lot more attention to.
Which brings me to the larger and perhaps more worrying question, Salman. First of all, you'll have to explain to a layman what you mean when you say a cyclical slowdown versus a structural slowdown. And then comes my question, given what we're seeing in the internals of the Indian economy, would you say it's looking more likely what we're going through at this period is actually a structural slowdown?
I think the easiest way to think of a cyclical downturn is, if you have a normal economy, generally it's growing, but it's not a straight line. You basically have a trend line, and then you go up, and sometimes you go down. Sometimes you're expanding, and sometimes you're receding in some ways. Uh, and uh, and this happens. It happens. Is the part of the business cycle. It happens all the time. And the difference between that and a structural problem is that structural downturns have they have kind of, in some ways, they're sustained because there are problems there. And one easy way to kind of one good example is unemployment. If you take cyclical downturn, unemployment goes down, employment goes down, and then after some time, as the economy recovers, it goes up. If you remember the global financial crisis, and in America, there was huge unemployment, almost double digit at one point, and then it started recovering, and now you've had this recovery for years and years and years, and unemployment has gone down to the lowest levels in 40, 50 years now. In India, this is a structural problem. Why? Because unemployment in India has been a problem not just for the Modi government, but for the Dr. Manmohan Singh government, and even before that, actually, during Mr. Vajpayee's time. So that is a structural problem. Agricultural sector. We have structural issues in the agricultural sector, right? So, so I think the way to think about structural problems is that there is something that is inhibiting progress in these areas, and this is kind of this is so on a sustained basis. It always ends up as a problem. Farmers' suicides, they're a problem because we have a problem in the agricultural sector. That sector needs reforms, and no matter what we do, yes, it'll have ups and downs, but to sustain its progress, we need reforms. And so I think that's the way I would describe it.
Would you be able to, Salman, attach some kind of time reference to this? The point I'm making is, how long do you think we're looking at this period of low growth and perhaps very, very poor internals in terms of what's happening on the industrial side, etc.? Is it a 5-year phase? Is it a 10-year phase? How long do you think the economy will continue to struggle?
Well, look, I mean, if you think about what India's growth potential is, many would say that perhaps India should be growing at about 8% or so. That used to be the consensus figure. But you can grow at 8%. But the question is, will you grow at 8% for a decade, 2 decades, or will you just grow at 8% for 2 years, 3 years, and then go back down? If you assume for a moment that what the CSO's GDP data suggests, that it is accurate. It is not. We all know it's not. But let us assume for a moment that it's accurate. But then what's been happening to that? It's actually gone up, and then it started declining, right? Even before, by the way, demonetization, it had started, after going up, it started coming down. Then after demonetization, it kind of, before demonetization started declining, then it kept going down. And then it came up, and then again it's declining. So what that tells me is that if you want to sustain growth, you need something that has not happened. And we have to understand what has not happened, right? So, when people say that this slowdown is a result of demonetization and GST, it is not entirely accurate to my mind. Yes, it is so. This is the most proximate. You can say these are the most proximate causes of what is happening in the economy. I mean, of course, you take out cash and you destroy businesses and livelihoods. What will you see? You'll see a demand problem, and that's what we're seeing. It's a structural demand problem now. But it goes beyond that, to my mind, because you have problems in the financial sector that are long-standing. You have problems in the agricultural sector that are long-standing. You have problems in the industrial sector that are long-standing because you're not able to compete. And why are you not able to compete? I would say in many areas we're not able to compete because we have not focused adequate attention on one critical factor, and that is human capital. Human capital is not discussed at all in India. We do not talk enough about health and education. We do not talk enough about how citizens need to be productive, and they can then use other factors of production to make India competitive. I'm sorry. I mean, you can do as much, kind of tinkering in budgets and all that, and you can have lots of discussions and article writing and all that stuff. But the basic stuff is, can we have people who are productive, who are innovative, who can come to this new economy and really compete with everybody else? Because they're not just competing with each other; they have to compete now with everybody. So it's a new world. I'm sorry. You can have this. You keep talking about National Register of Citizens and temples and all this stuff. Meanwhile, the world is doing something entirely different. There's a whole different discussion going on. You just said yesterday, I think, there's a company, a solar energy company, funded in part by Bill Gates, that came up with this revolutionary kind of idea that you could use solar energy to power cement plants, because you could have solar power for lots of different things, but it was not intense enough for cement plants. They seem to have a breakthrough there. That's what they are doing. What are you doing? You're basically, you're basically killing the telecom industry. That's part of the government's policy framework, right? That's what's happening. So, we just have to kind of be careful about not saying to ourselves that, oh, the growth has suddenly recovered from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8%, and now everything is good. It is not going to be good.
We are rolling around to another union budget as well come February, Salman. In the previous budget or ahead of it, there was a lot of clamor for the government to go out and make some bold moves, some big bang reforms. Even as we say that, at this point, the finance minister is holding with her fiscal deficit target, which means increasingly there is less scope to move or maneuver for the government. Would you say it's looking unlikely the upcoming budget would bring something of that nature, big bang reform or very, very large reformist moves?
Well, if you are creative, if you believe in expertise, if you believe in innovation, if you believe in learning lessons from other countries, then money is not always the binding constraint. I think then it's your imagination and your willingness to do certain things that sometimes may be difficult. But I think there's one more caution from me. I'm just a humble student of economics. We have much more senior people who weighed in. The former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh ji also weighed in.
There is a gaping hole in tax revenues. Tax buoyancy remains elusive as businessmen, small and big, are hounded and tax terrorism continues unabated. Investor sentiment are in doldrum. These are not the foundations for economic recovery. The Modi government's policies are resulted in massive jobless growth.
So, I think there is this sense that big bang reforms means divest, from public sector undertakings and everything will be okay. I think I see a lot of sell Air India, sell that company and all the stuff, and that will be a big bang reform. I think that is being myopic, because that is not the big problem. Because if you do that in a vacuum, you're making things worse. You have to have a framework for what is going to happen once. If you do that, what will happen with the resources, right? So I think in everything you have to have a plan, and it has to be a well thought through plan. So if the finance minister is saying, for example, that she's going to stick to the fiscal deficit target, first of all, it makes no sense, because they can say that we're meeting 3.3%, 3.4%, whatever it is, and then the comptroller and auditor general is going to say that the actual fiscal deficit is closer to 6%. And we know that you're going to do accounting gimmicks, and it doesn't wash anymore. That is not sensible in any way. Even the optics of that are like, everybody knows. People who know economics a little bit, they know that this is all fudged data. Nobody cares. What people care more about are the following types of issues. Are your institutions working well, or are you decimating your institutions? Because if you're an investor, why would you invest in an area in a country where there is uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, institutional kind of problems at the institutional level, where you have credibility problems with your data, Why would you do that? So I think the first thing the government has to do is actually, if it is really serious, should really focus on the institutional part. Get the RBI to be truly autonomous like it used to be. Get the CSO publish data that people can believe in, right? I mean, let experts do the work. You don't have to get experts from foreign countries if you don't like foreigners or people of Indian origin who are outside. There are plenty of good people in India who can give you good advice. Use that advice. Institutions matter. Institutions matter greatly for a modern economy. I think the Modi government has done a great disservice by kind of really going after these institutions. If you don't have good institutions, you can't really have a good economic policy making. So that's very important. Second is, you have to lay it out. You have to lay out your vision. You have to say that this is, we're committed to reforms. We're committed to having investors come in and we will protect their interests. I mean, what happened to Vodafone and what happened to Bharti Airtel, and how Geo has suddenly, become such a big player within just 3 years. The kind of anti-competitive, to my mind, totally anti-competitive pricing that Geo got away with is hugely damaging. And by the way, the telecom sector is a critical component of any country's economy these days. So you really have to kind of make sure that the message to investors is that we are serious about fixing problems, and that we will not play these games anymore. If you don't do those kinds of things, this is the kind of. And by the way, all this stuff about you're terrorizing people, and you used to complain about tax terrorism. And that, in fact, Dr. Manmohan Singh, in his recent piece in, I think it was in the Hindu, you see, people like me, we normally talk about fiscal policy, monetary policy. I think we're in some ways limited in our vision, but Dr. Manmohan Singh very nicely talked about social policy. And that is in some ways this trying to kind of get the sentiment of people, taking care of that. People are scared. They don't, if you have regulatory problems, if you have institutional problems, and if you have problems with things like agencies running after you, like the income tax and all the stuff, then obviously you won't have investment. By the way, this whole idea that we should just focus on the demand side. Oh, the demand is the problem. Demand is the problem. That is a problem now. But a country which is a low middle income country cannot hope to just have consumption as its engine. That is not, that is not a sustainable strategy.
Yeah.
Investment is needed. And how will you have investment? You need to fix these very critical areas.
How,
Otherwise, it won't work.
How would you rate global perception at this point, Salman? I mean, given what's happened with sectors, including the telecom industry that you alluded to, the fact that Vodafone is going out and saying it's becoming difficult and we're not looking to infuse more cash into this partnership, how do you think global perception of India as an economy, as a market, is getting impacted or stands at right now?
I think the global perception is already kind of, this would be a huge deal. Obviously, I mean it's a big play, and to my mind, it would be terrible. But remember, the other thing is that there are many people who used to think that India is a big market and we should invest in India, be there for the long haul. But because of this kind of uncertainty around regulations and institutions, data, and all this, I think many people are probably wondering. I mean, should we even be investing? And they're probably looking at domestic investors. There was a story just yesterday about, or today, I don't remember when, about how local business people were actually sending out their $250,000 remitting that abroad, the maximum that they can, because they want to protect their money. Now, if domestic investors are not investing, you think foreign investors think that they know more about India than domestic investors? They'll take their cues from there eventually. These things are not good. And by the way, if your consumer market is not also doing well, I don't see how people will bet on things that India needs for the long term for sustainable growth. So I think these things are devastating to my mind.
You talked, Salman, a little bit about some of the points that were raised in former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's recent article. And I want to tap into another facet of that, which is the threat that he raised of stagflation. I mean, we have been dealing with this low growth menace for many quarters now, but suddenly inflation is rearing its head. And on items like food, onion retails at 100 rupees per kg in many markets across the country. Food inflation is something that really begins to pinch people. How likely is it, do you think, that we're heading into a phase where inflation remains high and growth remains low, a stagflationary phase, basically?
Well, just hearing the word stagflation being thrown, being used these days, it's a little scary. From the heyday of Che Din and all this stuff, look where we are, what we are talking about. Stagflation is is a very serious matter. It can be devastating for economies, and they can be prolonged. I hope it doesn't come to that. Generally inflation has been under control, but that's this whole inflation targeting mechanism has also in some ways had a bit of a problematic impact, especially in the agricultural sector. So, I think the government has made a political choice, I think, to kind of keep consumers at protected, so to speak. But but that also meant that the protections that farmers needed and the agricultural sector needed did not pan out. And I think that is why that sector is struggling so much. And remember, when the agricultural sector struggles, your rural economy as a whole is suffering, and that actually feeds back into your FMCG and all these other companies, because they have to sell to somebody, and the rural areas are still the dominant areas in India in terms of population. So inflation has been fairly low, albeit it has had its own problematic impacts. But now food price inflation has gone up. That is a bit of a cause for worry. I don't know. Are we even? Maybe we have some problems in production, and I don't really know what exactly is going on. If people are not, if maybe there are shortages or something. I don't know what's driving this case of food price inflation. But having inflationary pressures at a time when your unemployment levels are also going up that's stagflation territory. But I don't know if that's going to fully pan out. By the way, the other problem is that I don't really know what to make of data anymore in India. I'm sorry to say. I don't know. I mean, unless we get a handle on our statistics, I don't think anything can be said with certainty. One thing we can say is that India is not growing at a rate that is needed for us to create jobs at the level that are needed. And that is a huge structural problem. And no amount of event management or headline management is going to do anything about that.
Where does the Reserve Bank fit into this entire equation, Salman? I mean, there have been rate cuts that have come so far in the year. There are indications and strong ones that there's more largesse coming from the Reserve Bank. What do you think they can do to address the situation, either in terms of, limiting inflation and the impact that's having, or indeed in terms of doing something to bump up growth or consumption?
Look, I mean, I think I personally think that the government of India has done enough damage to the Reserve Bank of India. We should refrain from making everything the RBI's child now. You're taking money from the RBI to cut into your fiscal deficit targets. You're taking, unimaginable amounts of money from them. Then you kind of keep pushing for rate cuts. You keep getting rate cuts, and you still don't see transmission. You still don't see investment picking up. So you have some problems, and I think, by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier. We in India, governments, this government or other governments, you need to understand that you got to, at some level, you got to give people a break. Get out of their way. Let them do business. Let them work. They will create jobs because they'll need to create jobs when they grow. You stay out of their way. If they create jobs, they're doing your work, because then you don't have to worry about unemployment. Your tax revenues will come up on their own. Instead of this other issue of, sorry, I know I have to talk about RBI, but this is important. People are saying they put money in the hands of people, give them money and all that, and then they'll spend. Okay, that can take care of a small kind of, the short term. But the only way to reduce poverty, to reduce inequality, and to have a prosperous economy is by giving people jobs so that they don't rely on your handouts. That is what, so you can do some short-termism again by giving people money. And by the way, the tax cut that the government had, I don't know, I think it's 1.5 lakh crores, I think, per year. Why not have a tax cut for smaller, individual taxpayers? Or, by the way, use that money for some social protection scheme so that cycle could start. So I don't know. I mean, I don't see companies taking that money and investing right now. No, sorry. This was a bit of a diversion, but let's go back to the RBI. RBI has been cutting a lot already. They've cut interest rates quite a bit. You don't see much evidence of investment pickup in India. At least I haven't seen it. Maybe you have. And if you don't see that, people are saying that there is a problem in the economy elsewhere. It is not the problem is not in the RBI. The only problem in the RBI is that as an institution, as an autonomous institution, as an institution of integrity, it no longer is seen as that. So I think that is a problem for the RBI. The RBI needs to fix that problem. The rest of it, tinkering around with interest rates and other things, will only get the economy that far. Ultimately, the government has to have a framework for, longer-term sustainable growth. I haven't seen anything on that yet. Yeah. And by the way, any strategy that does not include health and education is bound to fail in the long term.
I want to swivel for a second, Salman, to a space that we talked about right at the start of our conversation, which is banking. The finance minister indicates that in terms of bad debts, 80,000 crores have been recovered, but we're still going through several episodes of either NBFCs going belly up or other financial hiccups showing. Where do you think we are in the banking swamp? Have we cleared out most of the mess, or do you think there are more skeletons that are going to come out of the closet?
I think a lot of it is already erupting, right? You have the non-bank financial companies. I mean, these guys, that's a huge problem. I don't know what Mudra looks like, but I think there may be problems in Mudra loans as well. That is on top of the already kind of, plagued kind of PSB, the public sector banks. Look, I mean, this is a problem. This is a serious problem. It has grown actually over the years. I wish it had been tackled earlier. If anybody asked me, I would say get some top experts, including from other countries, and just hammer out some sort of solution. I mean, this government has political capital, right? Has had political capital. I don't know why they did not do this in 2014-15, tackle it earlier, because that time it would have been easier. Maybe they thought that economic growth would basically resolve this on its own. I think that was a miscalculation. They still have political capital, and they just need to get, I think they need to tackle this on an urgent basis. Mm-hmm. There is these kinds of banking sector problems do not go away on their own. And if you don't deal with them more seriously and with a degree of urgency, they tend to just hang in there. And the banking sector's problems have really hampered the economy, to my mind. So I'm sure there's enough in the literature that they can. There must be lots of information already available to the government. But I would say that get good expertise, have a final decision, come up with a plan, put it out there. Yes, there will be some political fallout, but what the hell is this political capital for? If you're so weak or scared that then despite all this power that you have accumulated over the last 6 years, you're unable to use it for something clearly needed, then maybe you should just not be in government.
There's another dichotomy I want to play by you, Salman, which is what's happening with India's equity market. Record highs for the Sensex and Nifty. And a lot of people point out that perhaps the MSME sector has been hit and bludgeoned, but larger companies are actually thriving and doing very well, which is why there has been considerable amounts of money that have come in from the FIs as well in the last 2 months, and you've got record highs for the equities. Does that fly with you, the fact that the stock market can coexist with a GDP or an economy that's ticking at sub 5%?
I, yeah, I think even in the equity markets, I think the companies, I don't think everybody's doing well. I think it's some companies whose balance sheets are relatively decent. They are actually driving, I think, what's happening in the market. And by the way, those companies can eventually, they will not remain immune to what is going on in the rest of the economy, because the economy is bigger than those companies. So ultimately, if things don't improve, they will start seeing some problems as well. Yeah, the stock market, this is like, I call these things sugar rushes, right? So yeah, I mean, if you want to feel happy about that, if it's like some government ministers wanted to say that, oh look, people are buying Mercedes cars, and these many hundreds of cars, and that just people are going and watching movies, and isn't that a sign that everything's okay?
2 अक्टूबर को 3 मूवीज रिलीज हुई और मिस्टर कोमल नाहटा हैं, बहुत बड़े फिल्म ट्रेड के हैं, आप जानती होंगी। उन्होंने कहा है कि द नेशनल हॉलिडे ऑफ 2 अक्टूबर सॉ अर्निंग ऑफ ओवर 120 करोड़ रिकॉर्ड बाय 3 मूवीज, वॉर और जोकर एंड सायरा। अब जब देश में इकोनॉमी थोड़ी साउंड है, तभी तो एक दिन में 120 करोड़ रुपया रिटर्न आता है।
Hey man, I mean, if you want to live in that bubble, all power to you. What can I say? But what you're going to do by doing these kinds of things, by saying these kinds of things, is actually you're going to decimate the lives of so many people who have no voice in this debate. Yeah. There are millions upon millions of people who have no voice in this debate, who cannot say anything, who don't even know what's happening, but their lives are impacted by your lack of imagination, your lack of decision, and your lack of political will.
You forgot to mention marriage over there, Salman. Even that has been suggested as a metric for thriving economic growth, apparently, that more and more people are choosing to get married.
Thriving, apparently.
Let me focus now on what I believe as well happens to be the biggest problem that we are struggling with right now, Salman, which is unemployment. I spoke with Mahesh Vyas of CMI earlier, who made the point that in urban areas like Delhi and Rajasthan, youth unemployment is as high as 25%. He did mention the fact that we've been through phases like this, for example, in the 1970s before. What would you draw from those experiences? And there are suggestions being put forth, such as a minimum wage guarantee of some sort. Do you think there's something that can be done along those lines to address unemployment specifically, and perhaps by extension consumption as well?
I think, look, unemployment, as I said, is indeed a structural problem, and unless we think of it a bit more holistically, I think that we're only going to come up with band-aids. So, if anybody thinks that the unemployment problem is going to go away in the next year or 2 or 3, I think that's a mistake. This is a very serious long-term problem, and to deal with long-term problems, you have to put in place certain measures that will start resolving the problem. To my mind, the best way to deal with a problem like unemployment is to kind of say, okay, how can we? What needs to happen at a very basic level? Companies need to hire, or small businesses need to hire. Why are they not hiring? Because maybe they feel that the investment environment is not that good and all that stuff. But maybe there's also another element to it, that they feel that for regulatory reasons, for tax reasons, for whatever, they're not able to grow their businesses, or they should not do more than they absolutely have to. If the government came up with a strategy whereby they said, you know what, we will finally bite the bullet. We and the bureaucrats will finally bite the bullet. We'll stay out of people's business. We let them do their business. Why do we not think about something to the effect that if you're a small business at a certain level, you have to do nothing. You have to pay no tax. Don't come to us. Do your business. I think there is one great problem in, I mean, there are lots of problems, but one major problem with thinking in India is informality is terrible. Informality is terrible. We've got to formalize everybody, even if they don't want it. People stay informal because there are problems with formal sector regulations. They're not trying to amass tons of black wealth, right? I mean, they're basically trying to get, it's a headache to, follow whatever regulations you have to follow. Now, in the ease of doing business rankings, in India has shot up, right? These rankings that are based on Mumbai and Delhi.
Yeah.
Nobody can argue with me that these two cities are now havens for doing business. They're not. I think people are gaming these rankings. I truly believe, and I passionately believe, that you let people do their business, especially at the lower levels, small, medium sized businesses. Let them do their business, let them make their money. Don't tax them at all. You can create, you can sit with economists and figure out what is a reasonable level at which you say, everybody just do your business. Because those are the guys who are going to create jobs for you. Your jobs are going to be driven by small and medium enterprises. If you let them do their work, you're not letting them do their work. For God's sake, get out of people's way. Don't go after them with IT notices and all that stuff. Don't collect taxes from them because they're creating jobs. What better way than to let people create jobs so that those people will ultimately buy things. Those things that are bought lead to companies' balance sheets, then paying taxes to the government. The government can focus on public goods and social infrastructure. I think that's the way I would think about it, that way, not kind of what's the silver bullet here, and what are the kinds of things we need to do? Can we just quickly get out of this unemployment problem? Of course, the longer term part of this would be, you need to have health and education. As I said again, I mean, by the way, who am I to say this? You listen to Amartya Sen, you listen to so many other people. They've been talking about health and education for decades. We're just not paying attention.
There is a view, Salman, that what happened through the demonetization phase and after that basically cleaned out the MSME sector. They're done. Would you agree with that point of view? Do you think there is still scope for that entire industry to sort of, reassume itself? Or do you think it's going to be without the MSME space that we move from here?
Okay, so this is one of my, obviously, I don't, first, short answer, I don't have the data to support something to the effect that the SME sector is dead. But I will tell you, this links up with demonetization and what these have done to the sector. I think in my book, maybe in one of my articles, I write about an IMF study. There was a cross-country study, not focused on demonetization per se. It talked about shocks to an economy and what these kinds of shocks can do to an economy's trend growth. And what they argue is that if you have a specific kind of shock, the economy goes down and then it goes back up, but it doesn't go back to the original trend line. So you have permanent loss of output. It doesn't come back. And I'm sorry to say that the same IMF today, recently the chief economist said something to the effect that demonetization's impact was transitory, lasted a quarter. No, it did not. Because when you lose a business, you basically, I mean, say you lose a business for 5 months or 6 months or something. It's not that suddenly you're now going to go back and start the business. Many of these people are finished. They're out of the system. But I would say that so that doesn't mean that all of the MSME sector is finished. I do think that if the government thinks innovatively, works with experts, you can not only revive this sector, you can make it the engine of India's future growth and employment growth. But for that, you have to discard this orthodoxy of we need to collect this much tax, we need to do this work, we need to impose these regulations, we need to go up. I really believe, especially for this particular sector, MSME sector, you let people do the work. they'll do what you desperately need. They will create jobs.
Let me focus as well on a story that's really been in front and center in the last couple of weeks, Salman, which is the electoral bond issue. Now, I know, of course, there are moral and ethical issues that have got layered into it and are being discussed, but I want to focus for a bit as well on what this means economically, what this means for that entire drive of addressing black money, and where the electoral bond system fits into that puzzle.
Well, I've been a strong opponent of electoral bonds from the very inception. I thought that this was a very corrupt kind of instrument. Any instrument that does not allow you to know who paid what money to which political party is a corrupt instrument. And now that instrument is especially corrupt because the State Bank of India is issuing those bonds, not the Reserve Bank of India. That instrument is especially corrupt because the government controls the State Bank of India and thereby would know which donor paid what money to which political party. And this has been initiated by a political party that I believe wants to stay in power for the long haul. And what better way to do that is by taking tons of money. Nobody knows where it's coming from. Nobody knows where it's coming from except the government and the political party in power. Not the party's allies. It's not as if NDA allies know where the money is coming from. It is only the BJP knows. I'm absolutely confident that the BJP knows because the government knows. The government knows because the SBI knows. So I think this is a corrupt instrument. This would be a vehicle for black money. I don't know all the mechanics of it, but this should be struck down by the Supreme Court. This is an assault on democracy. This should not stand. I wish my party had fought much harder against this and all opposition parties, because this is an instrument for marginalizing all political opposition in the country. This is a great instrument for doing that. And I think people have not paid much attention to this because people say, Mr. Jaitley used to say that, this is all about transparency. Can you imagine, saying that this is about transparency? This is about having, accounted money for in politics. You have no idea who's delivering this money. And so I think totally corrupt. I would say totally corrupt. And any government and any political party that wants it is totally corrupt.
My final question to you, Salman, is about something that you talked about, which several economists like Amartya Sen have as well, which is the social fabric of a nation, of a country. Much has gone down in this year in terms of social changes that our country has gone through. Where are we at with it personally for you? How are you feeling about it? And how do you think we're going to step into the years ahead in terms of the social construct of the nation?
Well, at a personal level, I'm a Muslim, and of course, I see the kinds of things that are going on, right now. And, when the government and the ruling political party have a clear agenda that kind of, in some ways, tries to marginalize my co-religionists, of course, it is scary and it is very disappointing. But I'm also confident that most people will eventually come around to realizing that this is not ultimately just against, say, Kashmiris or Muslims, all that. It is ultimately against India itself. And I'll use a basic economic argument for this, and that is, I don't believe there's any a country where you have such social discord, and then you have prosperity and peace. You don't have that. These things are diametrically opposed to each other. These impulses. So, if I'm not mistaken, I think Kaushik Basu, who's the former chief economist of the World Bank, very respected economist, he also wrote about how social cohesiveness is very necessary for economic development. I would think that if people intend for India to be a prosperous country, to really do well, become a global leader, then one thing you have to make sure is that you're socially cohesive and you don't have the kinds of social fissures that we see are being engineered by the ruling party and the Sun, the RSS, and all that. So it's a choice. Every country makes a choice. They may feel that this is something that they can do, and they can totally change India and all that stuff. But I think what will happen is that ultimately there will be a backlash, because when all is said and done, ultimately economics does prevail. And I think that this would be my a note of caution to those who think that they can get away with anything. That no, they cannot get away with anything, because ultimately people of India will want progress for their children, a good future for their children, and they will not be able to have that future if such social divisions are allowed to persist or grow. So I hope people, in the ruling regime, as I call them, they take notice. But more importantly, I think the opposition in India needs to do more, because robust opposition, I think Indian democracy is in danger. And if Indian democracy is in danger, I can tell you the Indian economy is in danger.
Thanks, Salman. We appreciate your time today. Thanks very much for joining in and giving us your candid view of where things stand for the economy and otherwise.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.